In the chaotic aftermath of December 7, 1941, while the smoke was still drifting over the ruined battleships of Pearl Harbor, a less visible but equally catastrophic crisis was unfolding 2,000 miles to the west on the lonely atoll of Wake Island, where 1,200 civilian construction workers employed by Morrison Knudsen were caught in the crosshairs of the Imperial Japanese Navy. These men were armed only with shovels and wrenches, and under the strict, unforgiving statutes of the Geneva Convention and international maritime law, they were classified as non-combatants who would be executed as guerrillas if they dared to pick up a rifle to defend their lives, a legal paralysis that forced them to watch helplessly as the Japanese Marines stormed the beaches or to die fighting without the protection of a uniform. This tragic vulnerability did not escape the sharp, pragmatic eyes of Rear Admiral Ben Moriel, the chief of the Navy's Bureau of Yards and Docks, a man who understood that the coming war in the Pacific would not be fought merely with torpedoes and dive bombers, but with concrete, steel, and the ability to terraform hostile geography faster than the enemy could destroy it. Moriel realized that the Navy didn't just need soldiers who could be taught to dig, it needed master builders who could be taught to shoot, leading to the authorization on January 5, 1942, of a new type of naval unit, the construction battalions, quickly phoneticized into the Seabees, whose recruitment strategy was a radical departure from the draft boards sweeping up terrified 18-year-olds from high school classrooms. The Navy put out a call not for youth, but for the callous-handed veterans of the Great Depression's massive public works projects, the men who had built the Hoover Dam, the Empire State Building, and the bridges of San Francisco, offering petty officer ratings and higher pay to men aged 18 to 50 who possessed the know-how to wrestle machinery. Enter Frank "Red" Mulligan, a 42-year-old construction superintendent from Ohio, with a face like cured leather and a body battered by 2 decades of ironwork, who stood in a recruiting office not out of a youthful desire for adventure, but out of a cold, professional anger at what had happened at Pearl Harbor. Men like Mulligan were technically amateurs in the art of war. They were paunchy, they smoked too much, and they had a deep-seated, union-bred suspicion of authority figures who hadn't earned their respect through sweat. But they were virtuosos of the internal combustion engine and the oxyacetylene torch. The training ground at Camp Endicott in Davisville, Rhode Island, became the stage for a bizarre and often comical clash of cultures, where fresh-faced Marine drill instructors found themselves screaming at platoons of men old enough to be their fathers, men who could dismantle a transmission blindfolded but couldn't march in a straight line to save their lives. The standard military indoctrination crumbled in the face of this blue-collar army, for when a drill sergeant ordered a recruit to dig a foxhole, a Seabee wouldn't just dig a hole, he would survey the drainage, reinforce the sidewalls with scrap wood, and probably rig up a lighting system before lunch. The atmosphere at Endicott was less like a boot camp and more like a rowdy, high-speed trade school, where the curriculum included learning how to fire a Springfield rifle and how to hotwire a bulldozer under sniper fire. The genius of Moriel's experiment lay in the fact that the Navy did not try to break these men of their civilian habits. Instead, they weaponized their ingenuity, embracing the can-do motto that was less a slogan and more a statement of professional arrogance. Mulligan and his cohorts, organized into the 1st Naval Construction Battalion, were issued the standard olive-drab fatigues, but they wore them with the careless disarray of a job site, their pockets bulging with pliers, welding rods, and unauthorized cigars. They trained on the new heavy equipment that was rolling off the assembly lines, the massive Caterpillar D8 bulldozers, the Letourneau scrapers, and the Northwest power shovels, treating these 60-ton beasts with the tenderness of a cavalryman grooming his horse, knowing that in the jungle warfare to come, the blade of a dozer would be more lethal than a bayonet. As the weeks of training compressed into a blur of mud and grease, the transformation was subtle but profound. They were still the same hard-drinking, swearing, independent contractors they had been in civilian life, but they had been forged into a cohesive unit that understood the stakes of the logistics war. They weren't going to the Pacific to charge machine gun nests. They were going to pave the roads so the tanks could charge the nests, and they were going to build the airstrips so the bombers could flatten the nests. By the time Mulligan boarded the transport ship heading west, the amateur engineers had become a distinct breed of warrior, one that viewed the dense malarial jungles of the Pacific not as a terrifying wilderness, but simply as another job site that was behind schedule and over budget, requiring a massive application of high explosives and diesel fuel to correct. The Japanese military, steeped in a doctrine that prioritized the spirit of the bayonet over the logistics of the supply chain, had absolutely no concept of what was coming for them. A middle-aged army of grandfathers and foremen who were bringing the entire industry capacity of the United States construction industry directly to the front lines, ready to turn the impossible geography of the islands into a parking lot for American air power. By the time the sun rose over the steaming emerald hell of Guadalcanal in early September 1942, the airfield known as Henderson Field had become the focal point of the entire Pacific War, a muddy scar carved into the jungle that represented the difference between holding the Solomon Islands and being pushed back into the sea. But for Major Sato of the Imperial Japanese Army Engineers, peering through his binoculars from the tree line of the surrounding hills, the sight of the runway was a personal torment that transcended strategy and entered the realm of professional heartbreak. Sato and his construction unit, comprised of conscripted laborers and soldiers, had spent months prior to the American invasion hacking that clearing out of the primeval undergrowth using the only tools the Empire provided: hand shovels, pickaxes, and woven wicker baskets known as moko, used to haul dirt one agonizing load at a time. They had felled the massive mahogany and banyan trees with handsaws, fighting against malaria and malnutrition, measuring their progress in inches per day as they leveled the hummocks of razor grass and coral rock, believing that their sweat was a spiritual masonry that made the airfield impregnable. However, when the U.S. Marines seized the unfinished strip in August, nature declared war on the conquerors, unleashing tropical torrential rains that turned the volcanic soil into a viscous black glue that sucked the boots off men and bogged down the narrow tires of the Wildcat fighters, rendering the airfield operational in name only. The Marines were fighters, not builders, and their desperate attempts to drain the runway with captured Japanese hand tools were failing against the sheer hydraulic volume of the monsoon, leaving the pilots grounded while the Japanese Navy pounded them from the sea. Then the 6th Naval Construction Battalion arrived, and the war for the mud shifted instantly from a biological struggle to a mechanical one, marking the moment when the Industrial Revolution finally made landfall in the Solomons. Frank "Red" Mulligan drove the first Caterpillar D8 bulldozer off the ramp of the landing craft, the machine's yellow paint hastily covered in haze gray, its diesel engine idling with a throat-rattling thrum that sounded like a heavy bomber on the ground. To the watching Marines, who had been living like hunted animals in waterlogged foxholes, the arrival of the Seabees was less like a reinforcement and more like a divine intervention. But to Major Sato, watching from the ridge, it was the arrival of a nightmare. He watched through his optics, expecting to see hundreds of men disembark with shovels to begin the same back-breaking labor his own troops had endured. Instead, he saw a handful of middle-aged men in greasy dungarees light cigars and mount the iron beasts. What followed was a display of torque and hydraulic violence that shattered Sato's understanding of engineering. For where his men had spent a full day digging out the root system of a single ironwood tree, Mulligan simply dropped the massive steel blade of the D8, revved the engine to a screaming crescendo, and drove the machine straight through the trunk. The tree did not just fall, it was uprooted, shattered, and swept aside in a single fluid motion that took less than 30 seconds, the sound of snapping timber echoing through the valley like rifle shots. The Seabees did not work with the frenzied desperation of the Japanese. They worked with the cold, rhythmical efficiency of a highway crew in Ohio, operating in 12-hour shifts that kept the machines running 24 hours a day, their exhaust pipes glowing red in the tropical night. They ignored the sniper fire that pinged off the heavy armor of the engine blocks, treating the war as a safety hazard rather than an existential threat, and proceeded to terraform the landscape with a speed that seemed supernatural. Mulligan and his operators didn't just clear the jungle, they moved the earth itself, using Letourneau scrapers to slice off the tops of hills and deposit them into the swampy depressions, grading the soil with a geometric precision that rendered the Japanese maps obsolete within 48 hours. The Pagoda Hill, a terrain feature that had plagued the Japanese engineers for weeks, was simply erased, bulldozed flat to extend the fighter strip by hundreds of feet. Major Sato, watching his life's work, the product of thousands of man-hours of suffering, being surpassed and expanded by a few operators who sat comfortably on padded seats, felt a hollow sensation in his chest that was far worse than fear. He realized that the Empire was fighting a war of attrition against a force that could replace human muscle with diesel horsepower, a force that did not need to adapt to the jungle because it had the power to simply pave over it. The Seabees were not just building a runway, they were demonstrating that the jungle, which the Japanese respected as a formidable adversary, was to the Americans merely an inconvenience to be removed by the application of sufficient torque. As the rain began to fall again, threatening to turn the newly graded earth back into soup, Mulligan didn't stop. He just signaled for the trucks to bring up the coral gravel, looking at the mud not with despair, but with the critical eye of a foreman who knew that the next phase of the miracle, the steel planking, was about to solve the problem that nature thought was unsolvable, leaving Sato to retreat deeper into the bush, haunted by the roar of engines that never slept.
The victory of the bulldozers over the jungle was absolute, but the victory over the geology of Guadalcanal was fleeting, for as the monsoon rains returned with a vengeance in late September, the newly graded earth of Henderson Field began to liquefy into a viscous volcanic soup that threatened to swallow the landing gear of the Navy's precious Wildcat fighters, turning the airfield into a graveyard of static aircraft that were glued to the ground while the Japanese bombers circled overhead with impunity. Frank Red Mulligan stood knee-deep in the black sludge, watching a Grumman Avenger torpedo bomber sink to its axles despite the best efforts of the ground crew to tow it free, realizing that all the horsepower in the world could not change the fundamental soil composition of a tropical island. It was here, in this moment of logistical despair, that the Seabees deployed the secret weapon that would become the literal foundation of American air superiority in the Pacific, the Marston Matting. Officially designated as pierced steel planking, PSP, these were not glamorous high-tech devices, but rather heavy 10-foot-long sheets of low-carbon steel, punched with 3 rows of lightning holes and equipped with bayonet hooks along the edges, designed to interlock like a colossal industrial jigsaw puzzle. The order went out to the 6th Naval Construction Battalion, and suddenly the airfield transformed from a construction site into a synchronized assembly line that operated under the screaming arc of enemy artillery fire. The Japanese heavy artillery positions in the hills, nicknamed Pistol Pete by the Marines, began to walk their shells across the runway, sending geysers of mud and shrapnel into the air. But the Seabees treated the bombardment with a detached professional annoyance, as if it were merely inclement weather. Mulligan, chomping on a cigar that had long since gone out, organized his men into teams of 2, creating a human conveyor belt that moved with a rhythm born of exhaustion and adrenaline. A truck would dump a load of the 60-pound planks, and the men would grab them, their gloves slick with grease and mud, running them out to the edge of the expanding steel carpet. The process was a brutal ballet of physics. One man would lift the edge of the already laid plank, while the other would slide the bayonet hooks of the new plank into the slots, dropping it flat with a metallic clang that signaled the connection was secure. Snap, drop, clang, snap, drop, clang. The sound began to compete with the roar of the artillery, a continuous rhythmic percussion of steel striking steel
that echoed across the valley, signaling the relentless advance of the runway. They weren't just covering the mud, they were bridging it, creating a floating metal skin that distributed the weight of the aircraft over the soft subgrade, allowing a 5-ton fighter plane to land on what was essentially liquid. Major Sato, watching through his field glasses from the jungle ridge, could not comprehend what he was seeing. The Americans appeared to be weaving a floor out of metal, a feat of resource expenditure that was unimaginable to an army that scavenged for nails. He watched as a Japanese shell blew a 10-foot crater in the middle of the newly laid section, destroying a dozen planks and scattering the Seabees like ants. In the Imperial Army, such a hit would have stopped work for hours as officers debated repairs and morale plummeted. On Henderson Field, the dust hadn't even settled before a bulldozer roared in to fill the crater with crushed coral, followed instantly by a team of Seabees carrying fresh planks to replace the twisted metal, patching the wound in the runway in less than 20 minutes. It was a demoralizing display of resilience, proving that the Americans regarded the destruction of war merely as a maintenance issue. As the steel carpet extended to 3,000 feet, a flight of wildcats, low on fuel and desperate to land, approached the strip. Pilots, accustomed to the terrifying skid of mud landings, braced themselves, but as their tires touched the Marston matting, they were greeted not by a slide, but by a distinct, high-pitched zipping sound, the noise of rubber rolling over the perforated steel holes, a sound that would become the anthem of safety for every Allied aviator in the Pacific. The planes taxied to a halt without sinking an inch, sitting high and dry on the steel island in the middle of the swamp. Mulligan wiped the mud from his face, watching the planes refuel and rearm on the surface he had just built, knowing that the steel carpet was more than just a runway, it was a logistical stranglehold. The Seabees had done something the Japanese engineers had deemed impossible. They had divorced the war from the ground it was fought on, importing a prefabricated surface that allowed the lethal power of the U.S. Navy to operate regardless of the weather or the terrain. The amateurs had paved the jungle, and as the Wildcats roared back into the sky to hunt down the Japanese bombers, the metallic clatter of the Marston matting vibrating under their wheels sounded like the death knell of the Emperor's hopes in the Solomons.
By the summer of 1944, the war had evolved from the desperate mud-soaked skirmishes of the Solomons into a colossal industrial siege that spanned the entire Pacific Ocean, culminating in the invasion of the Marianas, where the ultimate objective was not merely to capture territory, but to construct the launch pads for the B-29 superfortress, a weapon system so heavy and complex that it required runways that were essentially interstate highways laid down on remote tropical islands. When the Seabees of the 107th Naval Construction Battalion landed on Saipan, specifically at the captured Japanese airstrip at Aslito, which was to be transformed into Isley Field, the challenge facing Frank Red Mulligan had scaled up from the primitive struggles of Guadalcanal to a feat of engineering that bordered on the impossible, for the orders were to construct an 8,500-foot runway capable of supporting the 60-ton weight of a loaded superfortress, and to do it while the island was still technically being cleared of enemy resistance. The Japanese defenders, entrenched in the limestone caves of Mount Tapachau overlooking the airfield, fully expected the Americans to take months to repair the cratered narrow strip that had been built for the lightweight Zero fighters, assuming that the sheer geology of the island, a jagged spine of volcanic rock and sugarcane fields, would buy them time to regroup. They were wrong, because they did not understand that the Seabees had perfected the art of cut and fill to a level of violence that rivaled the artillery barrages. Mulligan, now a chief petty officer whose face was permanently etched with coral dust, looked at the undulating terrain and didn't see a landscape. He saw a geometry problem that required the movement of 1 million cubic yards of earth in a timeline measured in hours, not weeks. The operation that commenced was a synchronized ballet of heavy machinery that operated with a terrifying sleepless intensity, earning it the moniker of the 72-hour miracle
among the awestruck Army Air Force generals who watched. The Seabees deployed a phalanx of bulldozers, scrapers, and graders that moved abreast in a line stretching the width of the runway, stripping away the topsoil and sugarcane in a single pass, like a giant razor shaving the face of the earth. But the true genius of the operation lay in the material itself, for the amateur engineers had discovered that the ubiquitous coral of the Marianas, when dredged from the ocean or blasted from quarries, possessed a unique chemical property. When crushed, watered, and rolled, the calcium carbonate acted as a natural cement that hardened into a surface nearly as durable as concrete, but requiring a fraction of the curing time. The construction site became a whiteout blizzard of coral dust, illuminated by the harsh glare of floodlights that turned the night into day, making the operators easy targets for the Japanese snipers still hiding in the hills. A Japanese observer, hiding in a spider hole with an Arisaka rifle, watched in disbelief as a bulldozer operator took a round through the windshield, shattering the glass, only to see the man simply duck, wipe the shards from his lap, and keep driving, because the relentless forward momentum of the cut and fill line was more important than individual survival. The Seabees didn't stop to shoot back. They simply radioed the Marine patrols to de-louse the hillside while they kept pouring the coral, rolling it flat with massive sheep's foot rollers that compacted the earth into a surface as hard as asphalt. The speed of the transformation was psychologically shattering to the Japanese remnants, who saw the topography of their island being rewritten overnight. Hills that had existed for millennia were sliced in half to fill ravines, and the jungle was replaced by a blindingly white, perfectly flat ribbon of coral that extended to the horizon. In a span of time that defied all civil engineering standards, working 72 hours straight, with operators napping in the cabs of their idling machines, the Seabees transformed a battered fighter strip into a heavy bomber-capacity airfield. The climax of this industrial frenzy arrived when the first B-29, a silver behemoth that dwarfed every other aircraft in the theater, made its approach, its four massive engines droning with a sound that shook the ground. Mulligan and his crew, covered in white dust like ghosts, leaned against their cooling bulldozers and watched as the 60-ton giant touched down on the coral surface they had laid only hours before. The wheels did not sink, the surface held firm, and the bomber taxied to its hard stand, ready to load the incendiaries that would eventually burn down the wooden cities of the Japanese homeland. To the Japanese officer watching from the high ground, the landing of the B-29 was the final seal of doom, not because of the bomb load it carried, but because its arrival proved that the Americans could conjure an airport out of the wilderness in 3 days, rendering the Japanese strategy of defense in depth utterly obsolete against an enemy who could build the infrastructure of invasion faster than the defenders could reload their rifles. By the late summer of 1945, the island of Tinian had ceased to be a geographic entity defined by its cliffs and jungles, and had been transformed into the largest operational airport on the face of the planet, a geometric marvel of coral and asphalt known as North Field that consisted of 4 parallel runways stretching 8,500 feet each, a feat of construction that rivaled the Great Pyramids in scale, but exceeded them infinitely in lethality. For Colonel Yamashita, a high-ranking Japanese intelligence officer who had been captured during the final mopping-up operations and was being driven by jeep toward the holding compound, the journey across the base was a descent into a psychological abyss where his entire understanding of warfare was systematically dismantled, not by the violence of the enemy, but by their infrastructure. He looked out the open side of the Willys jeep, expecting to see a temporary garrison of tents and desperate men clinging to a beachhead. Instead, he saw a fully functioning American city that had been transplanted across 5,000 miles of ocean. He saw paved 6-lane highways, meticulously graded and named after the streets of New York: Broadway, 8th Avenue, 42nd Street, bustling with a traffic density that exceeded downtown Tokyo, populated not just by tanks, but by specialized engineering vehicles that the Japanese army did not even have names for. He passed by massive tank farms holding millions of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel, rows of Quonset huts that housed cinemas, hot showers, and bakeries, and vast machine shops where mechanics were fabricating aircraft parts with lathes and drill presses that were powered by portable electric grids larger than those of many Japanese prefectures. The sheer industrial arrogance of it was suffocating. The Americans had not just defeated the island's defenders, they had domesticated the island itself, bending the very topography to their will with such absolute dominance that they had time to install traffic lights. But the true epiphany of defeat arrived when the jeep stopped near the edge of runway Able, just as the engines of the 509th Composite Group began to turn over. Yamashita watched, trembling, as the silver B-29 superfortresses, gleaming in the tropical sun, began their taxi roll, a procession of aluminum giants that stretched as far as the eye could see. He realized then that these aircraft were merely the arrow. The bow was the runway itself, the millions of cubic yards of coral that had been mined, crushed, and laid by the amateur engineers of the naval construction battalions. Without the Seabees, the B-29s would be useless aluminum tubes stuck in the mud. With them, they were the bringers of the apocalypse. Standing near a parked bulldozer, his face gray with coral dust and fatigue, was Chief Petty Officer Frank Red Mulligan, now an old man in a young man's war, leaning against the massive steel blade of his Caterpillar D8 as he smoked a final cigarette. Mulligan watched the Enola Gay lurch forward, its engines screaming as it fought for lift on the coral strip he had graded to a tolerance of less than an inch, knowing that the weapon in its belly would end the war, but knowing also that the weapon could never have been delivered if he and his crew hadn't worked 72-hour shifts to pave the road for it. To Mulligan, the victory wasn't magic. It was just a big job, finished on time and under budget, a testament to the fact that there was no problem in the world, not even the Imperial Japanese Empire, that couldn't be solved with enough high explosives and heavy equipment. The can-do spirit had evolved from a catchy recruiting slogan into a terrifying strategic reality. The United States had won the war because it had turned the battlefield into a construction site, treating the invasion of Japan not as a military campaign, but as a massive earth-moving project. As the Enola Gay lifted heavily into the air, vanishing toward the north to deliver the final sentence of history to Hiroshima, the camera lingers not on the plane, but on the ground, on the white crushed coral of the runway and the yellow bulldozer sitting silently beside it. The Japanese officer slumped in his seat, defeated by the realization that his Bushido spirit had been crushed by the blue-collar competence of American trade unionists who had turned the Pacific into a parking lot. The war ended not with a bang, but with the rumble of a diesel engine idling, as the amateur engineers wiped their greasy hands on their rags, checked their watches, and prepared to pack up their tools, having proven once and for all that in the calculus of modern war, the shovel, when wielded by a Seabee, was the deadliest weapon of all.